The Cook County Courthouse was a monument to solemnity, its marble floors worn smooth by decades of anxious footsteps. For Lena Green, each step echoed with a familiar, heavy dread. The air smelled of old wood, lemon-scented polish, and the faint, metallic tang of fear. She adjusted the simple pearl buttons on her best dress, a navy blue shift she'd bought for her son Jamal's graduation a lifetime ago. Today, she was here for his parole hearing. Her best friend, Rosalie, squeezed her arm. "Breathe, Lena, just breathe. He's been a model inmate. They have to see that." Lena offered a weak smile, but her heart was a frantic bird beating against the cage of her ribs. 4 years. 4 long years since a botched plea deal and an overzealous public defender had landed her sweet boy a 10-year sentence for a crime his so-called friend committed. Jamal, ever the protector, had taken the fall to shield his younger cousin. Now 24, the system had carved the softness from his face, replacing it with a wary stillness that broke Lena's heart every visiting day. They entered courtroom 4B. Judge Harold Williams presided from his elevated mahogany bench, a man in his late 60s with a face like a crumpled paper bag and eyes that held no warmth. He was known as a hardliner, a law and order man from a different era. The gallery was a tapestry of human drama. A young mother jiggled a crying baby. A man in a stained jacket muttered to himself. Lena and Rosalie found a spot on a hard wooden bench, its surface carved with the initials of the hopeless. The hearing began. Jamal was led in, shackled, his orange jumpsuit a violent splash of color in the drab room. When his eyes found Lena's, a flicker of the boy he'd been shone through, a heartfelt connection that spanned the chasm between them. She mouthed, "I love you." The proceedings were dry, procedural. The parole officer listed Jamal's accomplishments in prison, his GED, his carpentry certification, his clean record. Lena allowed a fragile bud of hope to unfurl within her. Then Officer Derek Miller took the stand. A broad-shouldered man with a close-cropped military haircut and a perpetual sneer, he was the one who had arrested Jamal. He spoke in a flat, dismissive monotone. "The defendant is a known associate of the Grove Street Kings," Miller stated, though this was categorically false. Jamal had never been in a gang. "Objection, Your Honor," said the new public defender, a young, earnest woman named Sarah Cohen. "There is no evidence to support that claim." "Overruled," Judge Williams grunted, not even looking up from his notes. "Continue, officer." Lena's hands clenched into fists in her lap. This was the same narrative that had convicted her son, guilt by association, and the color of his skin. As Sarah Cohen began her cross-examination, challenging Miller's biased testimony, Lena felt a surge of pride. This young woman was fighting for her boy, but as Sarah pressed harder, Miller's composure began to crack. "Isn't it true, Officer Miller, that you failed to log the exculpatory statement from the key witness?" Sarah asked, her voice clear and sharp. Miller's jaw tightened. "My report was accurate." "The witness stated Mr. Green was not the shooter. That statement is missing from your official report. Why is that?" The air in the room grew thick. Judge Williams leaned forward, his irritation palpable. "Ms. Cohen, you are treading on very thin ice. Move along." But Sarah, fueled by a sense of injustice, did not. "Your Honor, I am simply establishing a pattern of misconduct by this officer." It happened in a flash. Lena, overwhelmed by the tension and the sight of her son's slumped shoulders, let out a soft, involuntary sob. It was a sound of pure maternal anguish, a tearful release of 4 years of pent-up fear and frustration. Officer Miller spun around, his eyes landing on her. "You need to control yourself," he barked across the courtroom. "Your Honor," Sarah protested. Before anyone could react, Miller strode off the stand and over to Lena's bench. "I said, quiet down." Rosalie stood, placing herself between Miller and Lena. "She didn't do anything. Leave her alone." What happened next was a blur of blue uniform and violent motion. Miller shoved Rosalie aside. As Lena rose to her feet, her voice a strangled cry of, "Don't you touch her!" Miller's open hand connected with Lena's face with a crack that silenced the entire courtroom. Time stopped. The sting on her cheek was nothing compared to the seismic shock of the violation. The air left her lungs. The world narrowed to the smug, triumphant look in Miller's eyes and the gasps of the spectators. She saw Jamal lurch against his chains, a raw, animalistic cry torn from his throat. She saw Judge Williams, who merely sighed as if annoyed by a minor disruption. "Order! Officer, escort that woman out," the judge said, his voice dripping with boredom. But Lena did not move. She stood rooted to the spot, her hand pressed to her burning cheek. The humiliation, the rage, the sheer injustice of it all coalesced into a single white-hot point of clarity. In that unforgettable moment, the fear that had defined her for so long evaporated, replaced by a cold, terrifying resolve. The system had shown her its true face, and it was ugly. It had slapped her son with an unjust sentence, and now it had literally slapped her for daring to feel. As Miller grabbed her arm, a strange calm descended upon Lena. Her eyes, glistening with unshed tears, swept across the room, from her son's anguished face to Rosalie's horrified one to the judge's seat of power. She knew with a certainty that shook her to her core that she would not be escorted out. She was going to take a seat. The world snapped back into frantic motion. "Get your hands off of her!" Rosalie shrieked, launching herself at Miller, her purse swinging like a mace. The bailiff, a portly man named O'Malley who'd seen it all, moved in, his face a mask of confusion. The courtroom erupted into a cacophony of shouts and gasps. But Lena Green was an island of stillness in the chaos. The sting on her cheek was a brand, a permanent mark of her transformation. For years she had played by the rules. She'd hired lawyers, written letters, attended every hearing, worn her best dress, and spoken in respectful tones. She had believed, with the faith of a mother, that truth and goodness would prevail. That slap was the system's final, contemptuous reply. Her eyes met Jamal's. He was straining against the corrections officer holding him, his face a torrent of fury and helplessness. In that shared glance, a lifetime of love and lessons passed between them. She saw the boy she'd taught to tie his shoes, the teenager she'd driven to basketball practice, the young man who'd taken the fall for family. And he saw the mother who had never missed a visitation, who had sent him books and hope, whose love was the one unshakable pillar in his crumbling world. A single powerful thought crystallized in Lena's mind. No more. This was not just about Jamal's freedom anymore. This was about the very soul of justice. If a woman could be assaulted in a courtroom for showing emotion, then the courtroom was a lie. The judge's robe was a costume. The law was a weapon. Judge Williams was hammering his gavel, his voice rising to a shrill pitch. "Order! I will have order in my court. Bailiff, remove both of these women." Bailiff O'Malley finally managed to pull a furious Rosalie away from Officer Miller, who was now red-faced and shouting about assaulting an officer. O'Malley then turned to Lena, his grip firm but not unkind on her other arm. "Ma'am, you need to come with me," he said, his voice low. Lena didn't resist. But she didn't move either. She looked at O'Malley, really looked at him. She saw the weary compassion in his eyes, the conflict behind his official duty. "That man," Lena said, her voice quiet but ringing with a newfound authority, "struck me. In your courtroom, in front of your judge. What are you going to do about it?" O'Malley faltered. His eyes darted from Lena's steady gaze to Miller's smug defiance. He had a daughter about Lena's age. "This is my courtroom!" Judge Williams bellowed, standing up and leaning on his bench, his jowls trembling. "And I will not be lectured by a disruptive spectator. Officer Miller, you are out of line, but that does not excuse this bedlam. Now I am holding you all in contempt." Sarah Cohen found her voice, shouting to be heard over the din. "Your Honor, I am filing an immediate motion for a mistrial, and I am citing Officer Miller for assault. This hearing is tainted." "Denied!" Williams spat. "Bailiff now!" O'Malley gave Lena a gentle tug. "Please, ma'am, don't make this worse." It was the word worse that did it. What could be worse? Her son's stolen youth, her own public humiliation, the complete evisceration of any pretense of fairness? Lena's gaze swept past O'Malley, past the sputtering judge, past the furious officer, and landed once more on the tall, leather-backed chair behind the bench. The judge's seat. It was just a piece of furniture, but it represented everything that was supposed to be right. Order, wisdom, impartiality, everything that was absent in this room. A plan, audacious and insane, began to form in her mind. It wasn't a plan of violence, but of theater, of truth. She looked at O'Malley, her eyes softening. "My purse," she said calmly. "May I have my purse? I'll come quietly." Relieved, O'Malley released her arm to retrieve her small black handbag from the bench. It was the moment Lena needed. As he turned his back, Lena Green, a 58-year-old secretary from the South Side, did not head for the door. She took a deep, steadying breath, smoothed down her navy blue dress, and with a grace that belied the thunderous pounding of her heart, she walked calmly toward the gate that separated the public from the power. "Hey!" Miller yelled, seeing her move, but it was too late. Lena pushed through the little wooden gate. It swung open with a soft click. She walked past the witness stand, past the empty jury box, and directly toward the judge's bench. "You stop right there!" Judge Williams screeched, pointing a trembling finger. He looked like a king whose throne was being approached by a peasant. Lena ignored him. Her focus was absolute. The world had narrowed to this path, this chair. She could hear Jamal's sharp intake of breath, a sound of pure awe. She could hear Rosalie's whispered, "That's my girl." She reached the bench. Without hesitation, she walked around its side and stood before the imposing chair. For a split second, she saw her reflection in the polished mahogany of the bench. A black woman, her hair perfectly styled, her good dress on, her face set with a courageous determination she never knew she possessed. Then, Lena Green sat down in Judge Harold Williams' seat. The courtroom fell into a stunned, absolute silence. You could have heard a pin drop. All the anger, all the shouting was sucked out of the room, replaced by a collective, breathless disbelief. Lena placed her hands on the cool, smooth wood of the bench. She looked out over the courtroom. She saw the faces of the spectators, their mouths agape. She saw Officer Miller frozen in place, his face a comic mask of confusion and rage. She saw Bailiff O'Malley, her purse in his hand, staring as if he'd seen a ghost. And she saw her son. Jamal was standing tall now, no longer slumped. Pride burned in his eyes, fierce and bright. A single tear traced a path down his cheek, but he was smiling. Lena Green, from the seat of power, looked directly at the flabbergasted Judge Williams, who was now purple with apoplectic rage, and spoke in a voice that was clear, calm, and carried to every corner of the silent room. "Now," she said, "shall we try for a little justice?" The silence in the courtroom was profound, a vacuum waiting to be filled. Lena's question, "Shall we try for a little justice?" hung in the air, a challenge thrown down not with a shout, but with a quiet, unshakable authority. Judge Williams found his voice first. It was a strangled, incoherent sound that finally formed into words. You are in contempt. This is an outrage. Bailiff, arrest her. Get her out of my chair." Bailiff O'Malley finally sprang into action, moving toward the bench. But his steps were hesitant, his usual command absent. He was a man following an order he no longer fully believed in. From her elevated position, Lena looked down at him. She didn't plead, she didn't command, she simply stated a fact. "Officer Miller assaulted me. On video, I assume." She gestured to the small, discreet camera in the corner of the room. "Are you going to arrest me for sitting, or him for hitting?" It was the perfect, unassailable logic of her action that was causing the system to short-circuit. She hadn't fought back. She hadn't cursed. She had, in the most remarkable and brazen way possible, held up a mirror to the courtroom's corruption, and now everyone was forced to look at the reflection. Sarah Cohen, her heart hammering with a mixture of terror and exhilaration, seized the moment. "Your Honor, Judge Williams, a point of order. My client's mother has been physically assaulted by an officer of the court during a proceeding. This hearing is irrevocably compromised. I renew my motion for a mistrial and move for the immediate dismissal of all charges against Jamal Green based on prosecutorial and police misconduct." "Denied! All of it denied!" Williams sputtered, but the wind had been taken out of his sails. The heroic simplicity of Lena's act had stolen his power. Lena, in the judge's chair, felt a surreal disconnect. The leather was cool and stiff beneath her. The bench was littered with his things: a gavel, a legal pad, a half-empty glass of water, a worn copy of the Illinois statutes. It was all so ordinary. This seat of ultimate authority from which fates were decided was just a desk. The man who usually sat here was just a man, a flawed, biased, angry old man. Her mind drifted, the adrenaline creating a strange clarity. She thought of her own father, a proud man who had worked 2 jobs his whole life and had drilled into her the importance of respectability. "You have to be twice as good, Lena, to get half as much," he'd say. She had lived by that code, and where had it gotten her? To a courtroom where her son was in chains and she was slapped for crying. A new thought, a profound one, began to dawn on her. What if respectability was a trap? What if the system was designed so that playing by its rules was a guarantee you would lose? True power wasn't in following the decorum of a broken game. It was in having the courage to change the game itself. She looked at Jamal. The chains on his wrists and ankles seemed heavier now, more obscene. From this vantage point, she could see the entire courtroom as a stage, and every person in it was playing a role. The indifferent judge, the brutal cop, the overwhelmed lawyer, the grieving mother, the imprisoned son, and she had just stepped out of her assigned role. "Mom," Jamal's voice cut through the tension, strong and clear. "It's okay. Get down, please. I can't have you getting in more trouble for me." His words were a dagger to her heart. Even now, in chains, he was trying to protect her. Her tearful eyes met his, and she saw not a convicted felon, but her little boy. She saw the toddler who used to hide behind her legs when strangers came to the door. She saw the teenager who stayed up late helping his younger cousin with his math homework. She saw the man who had sacrificed his own future out of a misguided sense of loyalty. "No," she thought, her resolve hardening like steel. "This ends now." She turned her attention back to the fuming Judge Williams. "You talk about contempt," she said, her voice losing its calm and gaining an edge of righteous fire. "What is the greater contempt? A mother's tear or a policeman's fist? What is the greater outrage? A young man's stolen life or a woman in a chair?" She leaned forward, her hands flat on the bench. "You sit up here every day and you look down on people. You see case numbers and charges. You don't see sons and mothers. You don't see lives. You see disruptions." She paused, letting her words sink in. "Well, today the disruption is sitting in your seat, and she's not moving until someone listens." In the gallery, a woman who had been nervously twisting a tissue began to clap. It was a slow, solitary clap that echoed in the silence. Then the man next to her joined in. Then another and another. Soon, a wave of applause was rolling through the courtroom, a spontaneous, defiant standing ovation for the woman in the judge's chair. It was the sound of the powerless finding a voice. Officer Miller took a step toward the bench, his face a thundercloud. "This is a circus! I'm taking her down!" "You will not!" A new voice boomed from the back of the courtroom. All heads turned. Standing in the doorway was a tall, distinguished black man in an impeccably tailored suit. It was Jonathan Briggs, a legendary civil rights attorney Lena had only ever seen on the news. He had been alerted by a frantic call from Sarah Cohen's paralegal the moment the slap had happened. "Jonathan Briggs," he announced, his voice resonating with authority. "I am representing Ms. Lena Green." and I advise everyone in this room to not lay a single finger on my client." He walked slowly down the aisle, his eyes taking in the scene. The applauding gallery, the chained Jamal, the apoplectic judge, and Lena, serene and powerful in the center of it all. He stopped before the bench and looked up at Lena, a glimmer of respect in his eyes. He gave her a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Then he turned to Judge Williams. "Harold, it seems your courtroom has a new presiding officer, and from where I'm standing, she's making more sense than you have in years." The dynamic in the room shifted instantly with Jonathan Briggs's arrival. He was a force of nature, a man whose very presence commanded a different kind of respect, one earned through decades of battling institutional giants. The scattered applause died down, replaced by a breathless anticipation. The circus was over. The trial was about to begin. Judge Williams looked like he'd been slapped himself. "Briggs, what is the meaning of this? This woman is in contempt. She has usurped my bench." "Has she?" Briggs asked calmly, placing his briefcase on the prosecution's table. "Or has she simply performed a citizen's arrest on the entire concept of this proceeding?" He turned his gaze to the court reporter. "Make sure you get every word of this, Sheila. This will be studied in law schools for decades." He then looked at Lena, still seated in the tall chair. "Ms. Green, my name is Jonathan Briggs. You have performed one of the most courageous acts of civil disobedience I have ever witnessed. You have my utmost respect. Please, if you would, continue to hold the fort. I think your point is being made quite eloquently." Lena, her heart swelling with a mixture of relief and terror, simply nodded. She was trembling inside, but her exterior remained a bastion of calm. From this chair, she could see the cogs of the machine, and for the first time, she saw how they could be made to jam. Briggs turned his attention to Officer Miller, who had taken a step back, his bravado visibly deflating under the attorney's laser-like focus. "Officer Miller, you are, as of this moment, suspended from your duties pending an investigation into the assault of Lena Green. The video footage from this courtroom is already being secured. I suggest you contact your union representative." He didn't wait for a response. He pivoted to Judge Williams. "Harold, you have a choice. You can continue to bluster and have this entire spectacle play out on the evening news, further eroding what little public trust this institution has left. Or you can do the right thing." "The right thing?" Williams spat. "She is in my chair." "A chair you are unworthy of at this moment," Briggs countered, his voice dropping to a deadly calm. "You allowed a police officer to assault a spectator without so much as a reprimand. You have consistently allowed prejudicial and unsubstantiated testimony against Mr. Green. Your bias is a stain on this bench. So here is what is going to happen. You are going to recuse yourself from this case, effective immediately. You are going to grant Ms. Cohen's motion for a mistrial, and you are going to release Jamal Green on his own recognizance, pending a new hearing before a different judge." "I will do no such thing," Williams roared, his face purpling. "Then," Briggs said, a small, cold smile playing on his lips, "I will file motions so fast your head will spin. I will have you investigated by the Judicial Conduct Board. I will hold a press conference on these very steps, and I will show the world the video of a Cook County Sheriff's deputy assaulting a grieving black mother and a Cook County judge doing nothing about it. Your career will be over by lunchtime. Choose." The silence that followed was heavier than any that had come before. It was the sound of a paradigm shattering. Judge Williams looked from Briggs's unyielding face to Lena's steady gaze from his own chair. He looked at the gallery where cell phones were now openly recording. He looked at Bailiff O'Malley, who pointedly looked away. He was beaten, and he knew it. The old world of unchallenged authority was crumbling around him. His shoulders slumped. The rage drained from his face, leaving behind a pale, defeated old man. He looked for the first time his age. "The court," he began, his voice a hoarse whisper. He cleared his throat. The court finds itself in an unprecedented situation. He took a deep, shuddering breath. In the interest of justice, I am recusing myself from the matter of the People versus Jamal Green. The motion for a mistrial is granted. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Furthermore, Williams continued, the words seeming to physically pain him, given the extraordinary circumstances and the clear evidence of misconduct, the defendant is released on his own recognizance. His record is to be expunged. The case is dismissed. For a moment there was no sound. Then a single, joyous sob escaped Rosalie's lips. It was the trigger. The courtroom exploded. People cheered. Jamal's head fell forward, his body shuddering with the force of his relief. The corrections officer, looking confused, began the process of unshackling him. Lena watched it all from the bench, a silent witness to the miracle she had wrought. She saw the chains fall away from her son's ankles, clattering to the floor, a sound more beautiful to her than any symphony. She saw him rub his wrists, his movements slow, disbelieving. Then he looked up at her. He walked slowly through the little gate, past the speechless Officer Miller, past Jonathan Briggs, and straight to the bench. He looked up at his mother, sitting in the judge's chair, and the tears he had been holding back finally fell freely. "Mom," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "you did it!" Lena finally rose from the chair. Her legs felt weak, but her spirit was soaring. She walked down the few steps, and Jamal enveloped her in a crushing hug. It was their first embrace in 4 years, without glass between them, without guards watching. She buried her face in his shoulder, breathing in the scent of him. No longer the boy she remembered, but the man he had become. It was an incredible, heartfelt moment of pure, unadulterated victory. "We did it, baby," she whispered, her own tears soaking his orange jumpsuit. "We did it together." Over Jamal's shoulder, she saw Jonathan Briggs watching them, a look of deep satisfaction on his face. He gave her another nod, this one filled with unmistakable admiration. Lena's eyes then traveled back to the judge's chair. It was just a chair again, but for a few unforgettable minutes, it had been a pulpit, a platform, a throne of truth. She had taken a seat, and in doing so, she had stood up for her son, for herself, and for everyone who had ever felt small and powerless in the face of an uncaring system. The lesson was searing itself into her soul. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is to simply refuse to accept your assigned place. Sometimes you have to take the seat at the head of the table, even if you weren't invited. The victory outside the Cook County Courthouse was televised. Lena, flanked by a beaming Jamal, a triumphant Rosalie, and the formidable Jonathan Briggs, stood on the steps as a swarm of reporters shouted questions. The afternoon sun felt like a benediction after the stale, oppressive air of the courtroom. "Miss Green, what gave you the courage to do it?" "Jamal, how does it feel to be free?" "Mr. Briggs, will you be suing the city?" Lena handled it with a grace that surprised her. "I did what any mother would do for her child," she said, her voice firm. The phrase would become a headline, a rallying cry. She was a hero, an icon of maternal resilience. But as the flashbulbs popped and the microphones were thrust in her face, a strange, hollow feeling began to open up inside her. The adrenaline that had sustained her was receding, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion and the first tremors of shock. Jonathan Briggs expertly fielded the legal questions, announcing his intent to file a substantial civil lawsuit against the city, the police department, and Judge Williams personally. "What happened in that courtroom today was not just an assault on Lena Green," he boomed. "It was an assault on justice itself, and we will not rest until there is full accountability." Later, at Rosalie's small, cozy house, they celebrated with a feast of fried chicken, collard greens, and macaroni and cheese, Jamal's request. The table was loud and joyful, filled with aunts, cousins, and neighbors who had prayed for this day. Jamal, showered and wearing a set of Rosalie's son's old clothes, looked like a man returned from the dead, slowly rediscovering the taste of freedom and family. Lena smiled. She hugged. She accepted the toasts in her honor. But her mind was 1,000 miles away, replaying the crack of Miller's hand against her cheek, the feeling of the stiff leather under her palms, the stunned silence of the room. The heroic act was over, and now the woman was left to deal with the aftermath. That night, lying in Rosalie's guest room, the images wouldn't leave her. She jerked awake from a half-sleep, her cheek tingling with the phantom sting of the slap. The darkness felt oppressive. The incredible high of the day had crashed, leaving a residue of fear. Officer Miller was suspended, but he was still out there. The system had bent today, but it was a massive, ancient beast, and it would not forget the woman who had humiliated it. The next few days were a whirlwind. Interviews, meetings with Briggs, and the simple, profound joy of having Jamal home. He moved back into her small, tidy house, and the sound of his footsteps in the hallway was a balm to her soul. But he too was struggling. 4 years of institutionalization didn't vanish with a judge's decree. He was jumpy, quiet, his sleep plagued by nightmares. The carpentry job he'd been certified for was slow to materialize. The felony on his record, though officially expunged, lived on in the shadowy world of background checks and whispered prejudices. Lena found herself watching him, her heart aching with a new kind of worry. She had won his freedom, but could she win him a future? One evening, about a week after the hearing, she found him sitting on the back porch, staring into the twilight. "You okay, baby?" she asked, sitting beside him. He was silent for a long time. "I keep thinking about you in that chair," he finally said, his voice low. "You looked like a queen. But Mom, it was so dangerous. What if Miller had pulled his gun? What if they'd sent you to prison? I couldn't have lived with that." Lena reached over and took his hand. It was a reversal of their old roles. He was now the worried protector. "I wasn't thinking about the danger, Jamal. I was only thinking about the truth. And the truth was, that system had failed us completely. Someone had to say it. Sometimes the only way to be heard is to speak from a place they never expected you to be." He squeezed her hand. "You've always been my hero, but now, you're everyone's hero." The word hero felt heavy to Lena. A hero was fearless. A hero was strong. She felt fragile, like glass that had been cracked and hastily glued back together. A few days later, the other shoe dropped. A plain, white envelope was left in her mailbox. There was no return address. Inside was a single typed sentence on a blank sheet of paper. "You should have stayed in your place." Her blood ran cold. She showed it to Jonathan Briggs, who took it seriously and immediately forwarded it to his contacts in the FBI. It was deemed a credible threat, likely from a sympathizer of Officer Miller or from within the deeply insular police culture. Suddenly, the world outside her door felt menacing. The heroic facade the public saw was now shielding a woman who looked over her shoulder every time she went to the grocery store. The personal cost of her public stand was becoming terrifyingly clear. Her resilience was being tested in a way she hadn't anticipated. It was one thing to have courage in a single, explosive moment. It was another to live with the consequences every single day. The victory in the courtroom was absolute. The war for her peace of mind, it seemed, had just begun. The media storm eventually subsided, replaced by the grinding wheels of the legal process. Jonathan Briggs's lawsuit was a juggernaut, and the city, seeing the damning video and the public relations disaster, began back-channel talks for a settlement. Officer Miller was formally charged with assault. Judge Williams, facing a disciplinary hearing and widespread calls for his resignation, announced his early retirement, citing health reasons. Life, in its stubborn way, moved on. But for Lena, a new normal had taken hold, one tinged with a constant low-grade anxiety. The threat letter had changed things. The world was no longer just a place of potential joy, but of potential danger. She found herself jumping at loud noises. She scrutinized every stranger who looked at her for a moment too long. The heartfelt joy of Jamal's freedom was now intertwined with the fear that her actions had painted a target on their backs. One Saturday morning, 6 months after the courtroom incident, she was working in her small garden, trying to find solace in the simple act of tending to her roses. The doorbell rang, causing her to startle, her trowel clattering to the brick path. She peered through the peephole. Standing on her porch was an elderly white woman she had never seen before. She was elegantly dressed, with sharp, intelligent eyes and a spine so straight it seemed to defy gravity. She held a leather-bound book in her hands. Cautiously, Lena opened the door. "Can I help you?" "Lena Green?" the woman asked, her voice clear and firm. "Yes?" "My name is Eleanor Williams," the woman said. "Harold was my husband." Lena's breath caught in her throat. Instinctively, she took a step back, her hand going to the door frame for support. The judge's wife. What was she doing here? Was this some kind of confrontation? Eleanor Williams seemed to read her mind. "Please, don't be alarmed. I'm not here to cause trouble. May I come in? I have something I need to say to you." Hesitantly, Lena stepped aside and led her into the living room. They sat opposite each other, the coffee table between them like a demilitarized zone. The air was thick with unspoken history. "First," Eleanor began, placing the leather book on the table, "I want to apologize for my husband. What he did in that courtroom, what he allowed to happen, was wrong. It was a betrayal of the oath he took." Lena was stunned into silence. This was the last thing she expected. "Harold and I, we were married for 45 years, Eleanor continued, her gaze drifting to the window. "He wasn't always like that. When we were young, he was idealistic. He wanted to change the world. He worked for the NACP in Mississippi in the 60s. He was arrested 3 times for protesting segregation." Lena's eyes widened. This image of the judge was impossible to reconcile with the bitter man from the courtroom. "Somewhere along the way, he lost that," Eleanor said, her voice tinged with a profound sadness. "The system wore him down. The politics, the pressure, the cynicism. He started to see the world in us versus them. He stopped seeing people and started seeing problems. He became the very thing he once fought against." She looked directly at Lena, her eyes glistening. "And you showed him. Your act, your remarkable courage was a mirror. He couldn't avoid his own reflection any longer." She pushed the leather book across the table. "This is his journal, from his early years. I want you to have it." Lena recoiled. "I couldn't." "Please," Eleanor insisted. "I think you need to see it. And I think he would have wanted you to in some strange way. You reminded him of who he used to be. It broke him, but it also, I believe, saved his soul right at the very end." After Eleanor Williams left, Lena sat for a long time, just staring at the journal. Finally, with trembling fingers, she opened it. The pages were filled with the passionate, youthful script of a man she had never met. She read about his hopes, his dreams of justice, his fury at inequality. She read about his arrests, his fears, his unwavering belief in the power of the law to be a force for good. "We must never become so enamored with the bench that we forget the people who stand before it," one entry read. "The moment a judge sees himself as above those he judges, he has failed." Tears streamed down Lena's face. She was no longer looking at the journal of her tormentor, but of a kindred spirit, a young man who decades ago would have cheered her on. The shocking twist wasn't a threat or a new legal battle. It was this profound, heartbreaking connection across the chasm of time and experience. The system hadn't just victimized her, it had also devoured its own. That evening, she showed the journal to Jamal. They read passages together, sitting side by side on the sofa in a shared, silent awe. The monster from the courtroom had been a man with a history, with a soul that had been lost. "It's like he was 2 different people," Jamal murmured. "No, baby," Lena said softly. the final piece of her own trauma clicking into place. It's that the world makes us choose, every day, who we're going to be. We can choose compassion, or we can choose power. We can choose to see individuals, or we can choose to see stereotypes. Harold Williams made the wrong choices for a long, long time, but his wife, she chose compassion today. She chose connection. She closed the journal, holding it to her chest. The fear that had gripped her since the threat letter began to loosen its hold. She realized that her act in the courtroom wasn't just about defiance. It was about a deep, abiding faith in humanity's capacity for change. She had taken a seat to demand justice for her son, but in doing so, she had offered a form of grace to a lost old judge, showing him the ghost of his better self. The profound life lesson settled in her soul, as clear and solid as the gavel she had held in her hand for those few minutes. True strength isn't about never being afraid. It's about feeling the fear, acknowledging the pain, and still choosing to act from a place of love and truth. And the most powerful revolutions often begin not with a shout from the masses, but with a single quiet person, refusing to stay in the seat they were assigned. She looked at her son, home, safe, and full of potential. She thought of Eleanor Williams, reaching across a great divide. The slap had been an act of hate, but everything that followed, her courage, her son's freedom, this unexpected connection, had blossomed from it, a beautiful, resilient flower growing through a crack in the concrete. Lena Green smiled. It was a tearful, unforgettable, and deeply peaceful smile. The story wasn't about a slap, it was about what grew from the sting.